Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus for the second week of Shadowlands M+. This week's affixes are Tyrannical, Prideful, and then actually at the time of recording this, I'm not really sure what the others are going to be yet. On beta, this week in the rotation had a Tyrannical Grievous combined, but there's reason to think that maybe Blizzard has backed off of that being an affix combo. If that is what we've got this week, it's going to be very rough. Tyrannical Grievous, really nasty overlap. But this week, I'm instead just going to talk mostly about Tyrannical Prideful and ignoring the other two affixes, because we're going to have 6 weeks out of every 12 being Tyrannical Prideful, right? So may as well think about some basic concepts with what to deal with when both these affixes are here. In terms of M+ rewards, there's pretty good reason to go into M+ this week. Because the reward for item level from a 10 or higher key has been bumped up from 203 last week to 207 at the end of the dungeon starting this week. And if you can manage to do a 15 or higher, that'll get you a 210 piece at the end of the dungeon, which is pretty good. That represents pretty big upgrades for pretty much everybody still at this point. The weekly vault rewards are the same as they were from the ones you could earn last week, so 220 for a plus 10, a pretty good level to hit if you can. 223 for a plus 12, or 226 for a plus 14. So there's really a lot of good rewards still available from M+, and it's a great place to spend some time, but not all dungeons are created equal. Some of these dungeons are a lot nastier than some of the others, especially with Tyrannical active. Let's start off by talking about the other side. So this dungeon is nice in that you can pretty easily set up Prideful on 3 of the 4 bosses here. You could theoretically set one up on Moisla as well, but it's not really something that is worth doing because Moisla, you don't really have a DPS check on that fight until after the Pride buff is or would be falling off. So for the most part, you want to kind of have Pride for the other 3 bosses, and that's actually pretty easy to do with the same route I was showing last week, which you can find on Raider.io. This week's routes are pretty much the same as last week's. For most dungeons, they are the same. For a couple of them, I've made some updates, so if you downloaded them early last week, grab the new ones now. And then for some of them, I've also got some other options available, and I'll talk about those when I get to those dungeons. But yeah, so for the other side, this pathing is really pretty foolproof, and there's not too much variation except in the Ardenweald wing between different groups and what they're going to do here. So you just want to start doing the trash from the entrance, grab all the trash down to here, to the Mechagon wing, and then backtrack to the Zul'Gurub wing, and you'll spawn your Pride after this pack, get it into Hakar. Then you go to the Mechagon wing, you'll spawn your Pride after this pack, get it into to the Mana Storms. They fixed a bug where certain race models would be too big with the Pride buff to go through this tube now, so everybody can do it, which is lovely to see. And then you go make your way to Ardenweald. And here is where there is some optionality with how you want to pull this area. You can do this in fewer pulls than I have listed here pretty effectively. And you can pull slightly different sets of enemies if you'd like to as well. So for instance, these packs are kind of nasty. These ones right here. Pretty reasonable to instead pull something like these up here. Then you would need to like invis skip these packs. That's part of why it's not in my route here, because I like to keep those invis skips to a minimum when at all possible. And this dragon just does like an AoE suck, and then if you're too close at the end, it'll fear you. So you just want to get out of that. Movement abilities or just being far away at the start of the cast is how you'd handle that. And then these packs are all in stealth around here. Usually you don't want to fight more than like the dragon and 2 of these packs is already pretty nasty. Focus your damage actually on killing the little ads if you're going to do a pull like that, because they are much more deadly than the dragon. You can just cleave down the dragon over time. And these are good candidates actually to bring into the urn over here if you don't want to use it on something like this blue pull. This is nice though, because having Pride for dealers Zyxa is pretty valuable. This boss actually trucks on Tyrannical with the Arcane Lightning. So this is a mechanic that you might not know about, particularly if you've done a lot of M0s. You might just have not known this existed. But in Mythic Plus, this thing starts to chunk. And it basically just debuffs somebody with a dot that starts ticking up Arcane Vulnerability. So each time they get applied this, they'll get 4 stacks of Arcane Vulnerability over this dot's duration. And then it will jump to the nearest person. And if it keeps jumping back and forth between the same 2 people, they're going to die. So you need to ideally set this up such that it jumps to a new person by moving with the Arcane Lightning to somebody new, or by moving to somebody with the Arcane Lightning if you have it yourself, right? Or if you don't have it, you move to somebody who does and take it off of them instead of it bouncing to whoever has already had it and killing them. That's pretty tough to manipulate when there's all this other stuff going on this fight, though, so be careful with that, particularly tanks if you can. This fight's pretty easy on tanks, so using your defensives and potentially taking the lion's share of the Arcane Lightnings can be a really useful way to contribute on this fight. Another little known tip here is that after the fight ends, if you're really quick, you can kill the fight right in this corner of the room where the little graspy hand thing that you click to port back to the start of the wing. You can just stand right there, and then as soon as the boss dies, you can spam click that, and you can save yourself like 5 seconds of the animation where you absorb the mojo back. So, big move if you're playing where 5 seconds matter. Halls of Atonement, this is a far more lenient... Actually, pretty much every dungeon is far more lenient on the timer than the other side. I didn't really mention it, but the other side, this timer is nasty. It's one of the harshest timers that you have in Shadowlands. Most dungeons actually have pretty favorable timers, even if things are pretty difficult in them right now. It feels pretty easy if you don't wipe to time a lot of these keys. Halls of Atonement, no exception. The pathing through here, this is pretty standard. These days, pretty much everybody does some kind of variant of this. If you're feeling up to it, doing something like an invis skip past these guys and instead pulling some stuff like these, pulling some extra, groundskeepers as well, making up count that way, is a little bit easier. Does require you to have an invis pot for a skip, or shroud, or invis belts, engineering belts to invis skip, which if you haven't heard about that, check out my video on engineering invis belts. They're really, really strong. This really easily sets up Pride, though. So one problem with skipping these guys is that you don't really get to have Pride onto Echelon, and Pride onto Echelon is nice on Tyrannical weeks. This boss is actually does start to ramp up the damage pretty harshly on Tyrannical week. So honestly, this pathing may even be better than trying to get fancy and skipping these, because if you do something more like the path I did in plus 15 of this dungeon last week, you end up with one fewer boss worth of prides, and so that's a drawback there. Halls, other than that, this boss is pretty rough. This boss, people worry about this one. They worry about running out of fountains. You actually can't run out of fountains on this boss. You get lanterns. You get a new lantern. Every ghost after you run out of lanterns will spawn a lantern in one of those 4 locations. So it actually doesn't matter too much if this fight goes long. It's a fight where you're not naturally going to have Prideful, and you don't need it. And then the last boss, also actually a pretty easy fight. Just make sure you don't get hit by those statues. They're going to kill you. Tirna Scithe, a hard one, again, to predict count for. You do want to make sure that you have Pride for Tredova, where your other Pride is going to be. Like, if you're going to have one onto Mistcaller, you can't line that up for sure. You could get a bunch of different amounts of count from the maze, so... it's tough there. The start of the dungeon, it is actually possible to line up a Pride onto the first boss. It doesn't work if you're not willing to do some skips, but if you are willing to do some skips, say you're playing Fae, right, and you can go through this little wood thing at the start, and you get something like these guys, and then you skip this pull, do this pull, and Pride into boss, or you could skip this pull instead and do this pull, and then get your mushrooms and then Pride into boss. That's a good strategy for a high key. It does require you to probably both be a Fae and use something like Saps, Imprisons, Mind Soothe, I think is even effective here, to skip past this pack. Other spot where you're going to want Pride is probably onto the last boss. So the way you just do this is either, most of the time, either this pack is going to get you your Pride, or you won't be at 100%, and then you can come over here and kill this, and maybe even this pack, and that will get you your Pride. And then you take that on Tredova and kill it. Plaguefall, in terms of boss difficulty, the hard bosses are kind of all of them except for the first. Even the first can be nasty, especially, my pathing here in order to set up this, Pride the way that I have it. I'm avoiding killing one of these Plague Belchers, and so you're fighting in a little bit less of the boss room. If that scares you, just kill an extra Plague Belcher. Maybe see if you can find a way to skip some of this earlier so that you still get your Pride onto boss, but that does free up some space in this room. But really, the boss that's going to break you in this dungeon is Margrave's Stradama. This boss pumps out huge amounts of damage on the whole group, And during that last phase, you have these adds that are just going to melee people if they get close to them. And it's hard for your tanks to pick up threat on all of them. They're all over the place. Tanks don't have a lot of great tools to do that. So it really, really, particularly in the last phase of this fight, is vital to get through that as fast as possible. I'd recommend saving all cooldowns for this fight, including Bloodlust, and then spacing them out through each of the 3 phases with an emphasis on that last phase, such that you can break through them quickly before you ideally get 2 Infectious Rain casts within a phase, because that will really start to murder you. Infectious Rain is a disease as well, so that's disease dispellable, and notably, Kyrian Potion, Kyrian File, is effective against that too. So using a Kyrian File on an Infectious Rain after you get that 4th stack can save a ton of damage on this fight. Really, really, really challenging one, though. I expect that on the list of Tyrannical end bosses, Tyrannical bosses that destroy your keystone, Margrave's Shadama is going to be atop that list. This expansion that's an early guess of mine, but we'll see how that turns out. Sanguine Depths. So this is a dungeon where I actually have 2 different routes available on the Raider.io article. There's the same simple one from last week that doesn't involve any skips. You just wait for the patrol here, and you walk through the dungeon in a straight line. That works, but this doesn't set up prides onto the 2nd or 3rd bosses, and particularly the 2nd boss, but actually, honestly, even the 3rd boss. As you start getting to high keys, a pride is very helpful for them. So if you're able to, I'd instead recommend using my other route here, the better Prideful with skips route, as I call it. You're going to skip a lot of the trash here with an invis. Actually, there's a cool Warlock Gateway that you can set up here as well. You could pull this pack and then Warlock Gateway over to here. I guess that just skips 1 pack, but that's still cool. Cool little Warlock utility. Not what I'm doing here, though. What we're doing here is an invis pot skip, and this then lets you set up. First of all, you can get more trash in this area. You set up a pride onto Tarvold. Then you do more trash. You set up a pride onto Berillia, who I realize now I don't actually have marked, so I should make sure I do that. And then you have a little bit more count than you need from the rest of the dungeon. So we're going to skip both this pack and this guy. And the way you skip this guy is if you tag the Grand Overseer and the Mist Dancer will run at you, and the Sentinel won't. And then you can just skip this with an Invis Pot afterwards. Invis Pots are really, really cheap to use this expansion compared to last expansion, because they only cost you 1 damage potion, whereas last expansion they cost you like 5 damage potions, right? And the speed potion alternative, Lightfoot, was really fast. Potion of the Psychopomp speed, the Shadowlands version, not as good anyway. So the opportunity cost on Invis Pot has gone down by quite a lot. I would recommend using them liberally in your dungeons, particularly if you're planning out pathing with your own group. Don't consider it to be a high cost to put an Invis skip anywhere. It's almost always worth doing if it'll save you a little bit of difficulty or time. Okay, let's move on to Spires of Ascension. So the bosses are nasty in here, but so is the trash. So I actually think that there's a strong argument that Tyrannical... I'm not sure yet, but I think Tyrannical might be easier in here than Fortified, because boy, are there a lot of tough trash mobs in here. Setting up Prideful onto bosses, pretty valuable in here. This route doesn't do a particularly great job of it, but if you want to do it, you have to do some more fancy stuff with how you're going to pull trash in this area. Usually something like that would involve pulling extra packs, like you pull from one side after the first boss and then go the other way instead of jumping to the platform. So you could like pull these 2 packs or these 3 packs and then go to the other side, and then you'd spawn Pride off of this pack or something. Or you could pull these packs and then go left instead. Either of those would work to let you get a Pride onto Ventinax. And then you would want to actually skip these to make up for that count that you made. So that's an option if you're interested in that sort of thing. You do get a Pride naturally onto the first boss. The first boss has this overhead slash, which is killing a lot of tanks. This is a huge physical nuke that you can defend against this by either using a big defensive as it's coming out, or you can actually like Heroic Leap away, Infernal Strike away, something fancy like that. Just be really careful because you don't want to cleave your DPS. If you cleave your DPS with that, it's a frontal. It will kill them. So this fight is pretty tricky with that for the tank, but... and one thing about it as well is when she lands from her first intermission, she delays her first overhead slash by quite a while. So a lot of tanks will like use a defensive expecting it to happen, and then it won't happen, and then it will happen like 10 seconds later and just kill you out of the blue. So that's a really hard part about this first fight, the overhead slash. This fight, the second fight, is all about just the bleeds that are stacking up on people in addition to dodging. Usually a good default strategy for this boss is to place the portals near the edges of the room. And if you're in a melee heavy group, you kind of want to place one near an edge and then move pretty far and keep doing that each time. And that will make it pretty easy to dodge. If you're in a ranged heavy group, you instead want to stack them as tightly as possible. And then your ranged have an easier time just keeping them all in a field of view and dodging from the same direction each time. So that's the kind of two different ways you can handle the boss. Either way, it's generally better to keep the portals near the edges of the room rather than the center. This boss, Orphirion, pretty nasty actually when it recharges and it gets those anima balls sucked in. Using something like an immunity, like an ice block soak of those, is a really valuable way, similar to how Mana Devourer worked in Upper Karazhan, if there's any Legion boomers watching this video. Otherwise, a tank can do it with a defensive, if they've got that, or if they're a Demon Hunter or something, a Death Knight that has Anti-Magic Shell, natural tankiness against magic damage. But if you're something like a Protection Warrior trying to do this, don't just assume you can soak all 10 balls and survive. You can't. And then last boss, even on Tyrannical, is actually a pretty easy one as long as your spear doesn't bug out, which it does sometimes, so good luck. Honestly, the trash, even on Tyrannical, I expect this trash is still going to be the hardest part of the end of the dungeon. Let's move on to the Necrotic Wake. Necrotic Wake, using the spears against the bosses to do a huge amount of damage to them and apply a damage taken increase is really valuable. The spear also pierces anything that it goes through and applies the same effect to them. So you can use that to take care of a wave of wormies on the first boss, or you can use that to take care of a bunch of adds on the second boss, and that can be really helpful. You only get a couple of spears though, so you only have a couple shots at it in the whole dungeon. And if you die while you're carrying one, it goes away. The other weapons and stuff can be useful as well, but they're more useful, I'd say, against trash than the bosses, like the anime balls and the hammers. So using those against trash, particularly if you can get this anime ball and use it against the trash in the Stitchworks area, that can be really helpful as well. You don't get to have Pride onto the last boss very easily. You're going to have it onto Stitchflesh, which is arguably a harder boss check. But the last boss is also pretty nasty. You want to make sure that you're keeping moving, of course, during Comet Storm. And then whoever gets sent down, when they come up, they're going to want to run to a corner, because when you get sent down, you come up with this debuff on you that expires and makes a big puddle of frost under you based on how long you were banished for. So getting to the corner and not using up too much of your real estate in the actual boss arena is really valuable for that as well. Theater of Pain is the only 5-boss dungeon of Shadowlands, which means on Tyrannical Week, the timer actually gets pretty tight in here. You also don't easily get Prideful onto Mordretha, which is a pretty difficult boss. This is a boss where once you start learning the timings and the overlaps, it can be a lot easier, but if you're playing in a group that is a little bit less aware of that, the odds that somebody is going to die to the first overlap of the boars that charge across the field, plus any other mechanic, is really, really high. So make sure you have all your cooldowns for that. A lot of the mechanics get empowered at 50% health on this boss, so saving Lust for then and trying to nuke her from there is a pretty reasonable thing to do as well. Also, if you do want Pride onto this boss, you can accomplish that by skipping these first 2 packs at the start of the dungeon and then pulling them after you get up to her at the end, and doing that first, and then you'll have a Pride onto that last boss. So that can actually be really helpful. The other boss that I recommend a Pride for is... There's actually an argument for all 3 of the Endwing bosses to have a Pride for, and you can't easily set up all of those. But I'd recommend Zav the Unfallen. This guy, as the fight goes longer, more and more of your DPS keep getting chained down and sent down to the arena where they're not able to do damage to the boss. And he keeps spawning these banners that you have to kill, so the longer he lasts, the more total damage you have to do, which is kind of a feedback loop, right? So having Pride, having Lust for this boss speeds up your dungeon. But some of these other bosses are harder, right? Like Kultharak really, really chunks. Usually the way you're going to want to handle this boss, when you have the thing that spawns the soul, is stand right behind, but not actually within the Grasping Hands, because those Grasping Hands actually do quite a bit of damage. Let's see if I can find it in the dungeon journal. Theater of Pain, Kultharak. Yes, this Grasping Hands, as you stand in them, this damage is pretty nasty. So, but if you instead stand right behind them when you're about to spawn your soul, it will still usually grab your soul, but you won't actually have to spend a bunch of time stunned in a damage thing. So Would recommend that for this boss. This boss also can be nice to have Pride for. The problem with Pride under this boss is, okay, so you spawn the Pride off of this pull if you wanted to set up a path that let you do that, and then you have to like kill it down here, and then you have all this travel time with Pride, or you like jump up, use the portal right after you kill this, and then the Pride, you know, teleports to you with 7 stacks already, and it's a really hard Pride encounter. That makes you use healer cooldowns you'd want to use on Kultharok instead. So there's not really a great option there, but it might be necessary if this boss is just messing you up. And then, of course, Gorechop. Gorechop is one of the bosses that, like, in terms of actual throughput, both in terms of healing, tank mitigation, and damage, is lower than the others. But the longer this fight's going on, the more likely there's going to be an overlap in mechanics that kills somebody. In terms of technical difficulty, this is the highest difficulty boss, I'd say, except for maybe that last boss. So there's really something to be said for prides onto all of the bosses in this dungeon, except for that first boss, which is kind of a non-boss. This boss a lot easier than all the others in this dungeon, if you are able to, as long as you're able to like stop the opportunistic assault from the rogue. The rest of it is usually pretty manageable here if your tank isn't getting too murdered by the warrior. So yeah, that's Theater of Pain. Whatever pathing you believe is going to be best for your group to optimize prides, I'd recommend doing that. I'd recommend fiddling around in MDT here and planning out where you want your prides, because there really is a lot of creativity. This is great affix. There's so much options for how you want to use pride. Yeah, so that's the dungeons. That's this week in Mythic Plus. Good luck out there. Hopefully it's not grievous, but if it is, then yeah, also good luck. You're going to need it. Hope this video helped. If it did, remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Stratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one.